The Palazzo Barberini stands with imposing grandeur on the Via del Quattro Fontane in Rome. Today, this magnificent Baroque palace serves as the National Gallery of Ancient Art, concealing within its deepest recesses a singular, modest canvas, portrait of Beatrice Cenci. A young girl turns to look back at us, her head enveloped in a white turban. Her eyes are melancholy, yet they hold a gaze that seems to plead, to demand something from the viewer. In the 19th century, when the great French author Stendhal visited this place, he was so utterly captivated by the unearthly despair and beauty dwelling in those eyes that he felt seized by a fever, compelled to write her story as if possessed. Charles Dickens, in his travelogues of 1845, sighed in profound sorrow, noting that the heavenly hope and the irremediable earthly loneliness contained within that gaze, once looked upon, can never be forgotten. A dramatic legend soon swept through the romantic literary circles, driving them into a frenzy of fascination. The belief that the Grandmaster Guido Reni had secretly painted her inside her dark cell on the eve of her execution, or perhaps had sketched her fleeting form from amidst the weeping crowd as she walked toward the scaffold. Yet, modern art history confronts this beautiful myth with cold, uncompromising reality. Recent scholarship suggests that the canvas was not the work of Reni at all, but rather the creation of a female artist of the Bolognese school, either Ginevra Cantafoli or Elisabetta Serrani. Even the certainty that the model is Beatrice herself has begun to dissolve into doubt. And yet, to question the authenticity of the painting here may already be beside the point. What truly matters is why, for centuries, mankind has looked into the eyes of this nameless girl and discerned the shadow of the patricidal witch, sensing a madness where sanctity and sensuality inextricably intertwine. To find the answer, we must strip away the veil of legend. We must turn back the wheel of time to the year 1599, to a Roman execution square drenched in blood, stained by lust, and shadowed by the sins of the flesh. On the night of September 10, 1599, a damp, ominous silence held dominion over the city of Rome. The surface of the Tiber River reflected the city lights in a turbid, dull gray, swelling heavily and deeply, as if whispering of the vast torrent of blood about to be spilled. Along that very riverbank loomed the Castel Sant'Angelo, and within its deepest subterranean dungeon, a 22-year-old woman was held captive, facing a destiny that would, in a few short hours, sever her beautiful neck. Her name was Beatrice Cenci, the mastermind behind an unprecedented patricide, an act that had plunged all of Rome into a vortex of horror and fanaticism. The interior of the cell was shrouded in profound darkness, as if utterly rejecting every color of the living world. Only the flame of a single meager candle cast her silhouette in pale relief against the gloom. Beatrice was draped in a shroud of ultra-thin white silk, the garment mandated for her execution. Its texture was impossibly smooth, radiating a perverse, exquisite luster, more like a bridal gown awaiting the wedding night than the attire of a prisoner awaiting death. In the darkness, her slender fingertips slowly traced the line of her own throat, that white skin, to be cleaved by a cold, merciless blade the following morning, trembled faintly with the terror of demise, while her ragged breaths echoed through the silent room, like the rustling of fine fabric. In that moment, Beatrice slowly raised her face, gazing into the empty void. What dwelt in the depths of those eyes was not mere despair. It was a strange, burning passion, as if she had transcended everything, embracing even her own destruction. On the very threshold between life and death, her body began to emanate an uncanny, suffocating sensuality. Some called her a tragic saint, abused and tormented by a monstrous father. Others called her a daughter of the devil, one who slaughtered her own flesh and blood. Why did this girl, once a devout Christian maiden, violate the absolute commandment of God and step into humanity's oldest, darkest depravity? The answer lies hidden several years before the blade falls. Far from Rome in a mountainous wilderness, concealed within a sunless, locked chamber. To unravel the mystery, we must first look back to her lineage and to the cursed reality of the noble house of Cenci. Beatrice Cenci was born in 1577 into the immense wealth of the noble Cenci family in Rome. Her mother, Ercilia Santa Croce, suffered under the exceptional violence and ceaseless infidelities of the father, Francesco, until she withered away, sick in body and mind, dying when Beatrice was a mere 7 years old. Knowing nothing of a mother's warmth, Beatrice was sent away to a convent, where, under the rigid discipline of Catholic law, she grew into a pure and deeply devout maiden. Yet, the peace protected by those white cloister walls was not to last. The moment her beauty began to bloom, her father dragged her away from the manor in Rome, isolating her from the clamor of the world. He confined her within the castle of La Petrella, a desolate fortress perched high in the barren mountains of Abruzzo. Its gray stone walls were a gargantuan cage, built to conceal every imaginable vice from the eyes of the public. The master of this castle and Beatrice's father, Francesco Cenci, possessed some of the greatest power and wealth in Rome. Yet his soul was stained with a bottomless cruelty and abnormal lust. After his first wife's passing, he took a gentle woman named Lucrezia Petroni as his second wife. But she too was nothing more than Francesco's slave. His infamy echoed throughout Rome. He was tried repeatedly for sodomy, debauchery, violence, and even murder. Yet each time he bought his freedom with colossal ransoms. And now he had imprisoned his young, exquisite daughter, deep within the recesses of this locked fortress, treating his own flesh and blood as a living doll, to satisfy his warped, malevolent desires. Inside the castle, a cold, damp air hung in perpetual stagnation. The torments Francesco inflicted were not merely those that left visible scars. He forced Beatrice to don lavish, low-cut gowns, attire designed solely to emphasize the pale canvas of her bare skin. This was no act of paternal affection. It was the obsessive fixation of a predator, fashioning his prey to suit his own dark tastes. He locked her in her quarters, denying her proper nourishment. At times, he would violently assault her stepmother, Lucrezia, before her very eyes, or summon courtesans to engage in wild, uninhibited revelries, forcing his daughter to watch, transfixed in horror. Each time the heavy iron key turned in the lock with a metallic click, the father's heavy, deliberate footsteps would echo across the stone floor. Hearing that sound, Beatrice's body would freeze in sheer terror. She could do nothing but clutch her crucifix, begging God for salvation. When he entered her chamber, he did not look upon her as a human being. She was merely a possession to satiate his hunger. With his eyes, he would slowly, relentlessly trace her hair, her shoulders, and her trembling fingertips, gradually eroding the boundaries of her sanity. In the dead of night, when he visited Beatrice's bedchamber, the deeds committed were a total collapse of human morality, an abomination where the sacred bond of blood was drowned in the shadows of a monstrous, forbidden passion. To face her own father in that room, where the very air was thick with malice, was a psychological execution that slowly consumed the girl's mind. Yet, the most despairing realization for Beatrice was that the Holy Church, the sole sanctuary meant to receive her cries and grant deliverance, had already been rendered completely powerless by Francesco, the papal curia and the Catholic authorities of the time. Blinded by the immense fortunes, ransoms, and bribes offered in the name of donations, deliberately sealed their ears to the screams echoing from that hellish castle. This was no longer a mere domestic tragedy. It was the grotesque manifestation of a societal injustice, where the clergy abandoned the vulnerable for the sake of gold. The vicars of God sold their silence for silver. relinquishing their duty as the maiden's sole protectors. No matter how many tears she wept, no matter how fervently she prayed through the agonizing nights, no heavenly hand reached down to save her. In this absolute, suffocating isolation, the pious faith within Beatrice's breast began to curdle, inverting into a dark, swirling madness, and a raw, primal instinct to survive.
In a world where prayers go unanswered, a human being, to preserve her sanity, had no choice but to transform into a demon. Within Beatrice, the modest desire to flee her father's dominion evaporated, sublimating into a cold, clinical malice, a resolve to erase his physical form from this earth. This was a mutation that transcended mere survival or self-defense. It carried a forbidden, intoxicating euphoria, born from crossing the ultimate line. And this madness did not remain confined to Beatrice alone. Like a pestilence, it infected the entire Cenci clan, whose lives had been equally ground into dust by Francesco's tyranny. First, she lured into the deepest shadows her stepmother, Lucrezia, whose spirit had been utterly broken by daily abuse. And then, Olimpio Calvetti, the castle castellan, who harbored a secret, warped desire for her. The stepmother, Lucrezia, once a gentle and submissive woman, had witnessed the perpetual torment inflicted upon Beatrice, and her own routine violations. In the crucible of that horror, her emotions, part maternal instinct, part absolute resignation, hardened into a lethal intent. She was the silent witness to the hell within those locked walls. A mother unbound by blood, yet tethered by a shared agony. Then, into this bleeding circle, stepped Francesco's own sons, Giacomo, the eldest brother, and Bernardo, the underage boy. Giacomo had been driven to utter destitution by his father, denied even the means to sustain his own wife and children. He existed in a state of psychological castration. His hatred was no mere rebellion. It was a bitter vengeance for the systematic theft of his masculine dignity. Young Bernardo, too, was a mere phantom, holding his breath within the cage of his father's abnormal obsession. The brothers harbored a deeply pragmatic, and therefore visceral, hunger. They knew that only through the old man's demise could they reclaim their lives, and their birthright. Yet, the one who would hold the most critical instrument of execution was the castellan, Olimpio. Though a mere servant to the house of Cenci, he possessed a fierce, forbidden lust and devotion for the noble, tragically beautiful Beatrice. Beatrice was acutely aware of his gaze. With ruthless precision, she wielded her own beauty as a weapon, using an ethereal yet profound sensuality to condition Olimpio, turning him into the loyal instrument of her lethal will. In the dead of night, in a subterranean chamber lit only by the flickering ghost of a candle, they pressed their faces close together. Upon the wooden table lay vials of opium and venom, procured far from the watchful eyes of the church. Beside them, the details of the assassination, inscribed on sheets of parchment. Though this was a council of blood and crime, the air hung heavy with a dense, intoxicating eroticism, the dark sensuality of conspiracy. While her brother Giacomo whispered calculated estimates of the inheritance, Beatrice met the starved gaze of Olimpio, weaving her words at a dangerous, breathless proximity, as if guiding his hand toward her bare skin without ever touching him, even without physical contact. The collective malice of the brothers, the extreme terror, the adrenaline, and the shared sin of patricide, caused a sinister, feverish heat to rise within the closed room. From Beatrice's eyes, the innocent tears of a maiden had completely withered away, in their stead dwelling a cold, demonic beauty, capable of driving men to madness. The very consciousness of defying God, the immense weight of the sin itself, transformed her suppressed vitality into an intoxicating, venomous allure. She knew, even if this plot succeeded, what awaited her at the end of the road was earthly ruin. The freezing cells of Castel Sant'Angelo. Yet, to end the living hell before her, she was ready to surrender her pure soul to the dark, offering it gladly, alongside the accursed blood of the Cenci line.
In the dead of night on September 9, 1598, the master bedchamber on the highest floor of Castle La Petrella was transformed into a theater of death. Upon the heavy bed, Francesco lay in a deep, unnatural slumber, drugged with opium mixed into his wine by Beatrice and Lucrezia. A violent night wind howled through the open window, causing the heavily embroidered, decadent curtains to swell ominously, and making the candle flames dance in frantic agitation. Olimpio and another hired assassin stood paralyzed, shaking with the high-altitude chill of the mountain fortress, and crushed by the staggering weight of the sin they were about to commit. In the corner of the room, the shadows of the brothers, Giacomo and Bernardo, clung to the wall, their faces pale with terror and suspense. As the men remained frozen, unable to move, it was Beatrice who stepped forward from the darkness. Clutched in her slender hands were tools entirely unsuited for a noble maiden: a crude, heavy wooden mallet, and a thick, rusted iron spike. Beatrice's expression was void of all human emotion, cold as a marble sculpture. Yet her cheeks were flushed with an unnatural, burning crimson, fueled by an inner euphoria and a desperate thirst for liberation. At this absolute moment, the sanctity within her inverted into a primal, predatory ferocity. Without a shred of hesitation, she approached the bed. She set the point of the iron spike against her sleeping father's brow, directly over the sharp ridge of his eye socket, and brought the mallet down with all her gathered might. A dull, heavy impact tearing through flesh and bone shattered the silence of the chamber, followed by a low, agonized groan, as a dark torrent crimsoned the gloom. It did not end with a single blow. Beatrice continued to strike, driven by a manic, rhythmic frenzy. In the darkness behind her, Giacomo and the others gasped at the visceral sound of tearing flesh, muttering phrases that were part prayer, part curse. At the center of this suspended, slow-motion world, the sharp spray of blood erupted, staining Beatrice's pale face and her thin silk shroud, creating a vivid, striking contrast of stark white and deep red. It was a moment of supreme, grotesque violence. Yet simultaneously, it possessed the transcendent beauty of a masterpiece, the absolute awakening of a maiden unshackling herself from a tyrant. She did not scream. She did not turn her eyes away. She merely exhaled a deep, feverish breath, an expression closely resembling ecstasy washing over her features. As she bathed in the warmth of her father's blood, the crimson spray moistened her lips, and within that iron, metallic taste, she tasted true, unbridled freedom for the very first time. Violence and aesthetics, external horror and internal sensuality, and a sanity completely dissolved into madness, all fused together like a finished painting. Beside the corpse pinned with iron, together they cast the body from the balcony, staging it as an accidental fall from a collapsed wooden walkway. Yet those profoundly unnatural wounds would soon catch the cold, unblinking eye of Rome.
The night of madness broke, and the stage returns once more to Rome. On the fateful day of execution, September 11, 1599, the clumsy concealment attempted by Beatrice and her family was instantly laid bare by the sharp, unforgiving gaze of the papal investigators. A sentence of death without exception, was handed down to the Cenci clan. The populace, deeply moved by Beatrice's horrific plight, flooded Pope Clement VIII with desperate pleas for mercy. Yet, the pontiff rejected them with cold, calculated cruelty. For he knew that with the monstrous Francesco dead, the execution of the Cenci family meant their immense, colossal fortune would be confiscated, flowing directly into the insatiable coffers of the papal curia. The Church, having betrayed the maiden and abandoned her to her fate, exposed its ultimate social corruption, feasting upon her death to gorge itself on gold until the very last breath. Around the scaffold erected before the Bridge of Sant'Angelo, a vast, suffocating sea of spectators gathered, painting the square in black. The execution of the clan was carried out with calculated, agonizing brutality, tailored to their respective roles and ages. Before Beatrice's very eyes, her stepmother, Lucrezia, was the first to face the blade. Yet, the most wretched demise was reserved for her elder brother, Giacomo. His flesh was torn with white-hot iron tongs, before his limbs were systematically shattered with a heavy wooden mallet, and his throat finally severed. The curse of the mallet, the very instrument used to slaughter the father, had returned to dismantle his own flesh and bone. Meanwhile, young Bernardo, who had no direct hand in the killing, was granted a reprieve from death, only to endure a psychological execution of his own. Forced to stand in the very front row, compelled to witness his family being butchered piece by piece. And then, the final figure stepped toward the scaffold. Beatrice. Her thin white shroud fluttering in the Roman breeze. She ascended the wooden steps with an unearthly, transcendent dignity, as her abundant hair swayed in the wind. Her pale, exquisite throat was laid bare under the harsh glare of the sun. The starved, desiring gazes of the crowd, and the executioners alike, converged upon her form in a collective, breathless trance. The metallic scent of her family's blood hanging in the air, intertwined with her overwhelming, desperate beauty, evoking a supreme, terrifying sensuality that drove the entire city of Rome into a feverish, ecstatic madness. She stood there no longer as a pitiful victim, but as a sorceress, enthralling and destroying every man who dared to look upon her. The executioner raised the massive axe, and the moment it claimed her neck, the roar of the crowd reached its shattering zenith, and the world dissolved into a blinding white light. Beatrice Cenci was dead. Yet, from the exact moment her flesh perished, she was reborn as an immortal myth. The portrait of Beatrice Cenci, the very image that would later drive Stendhal, Charles Dickens, and the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley into a frenzy of fascination, is the blood-stained masterpiece of the dark Renaissance, bred by the abnormal desires of man, accelerated by the absurd treachery of the Church, and perfected by the ancestral curse of family blood. Even now, from the other side of the canvas, Beatrice's timeless gaze continues to look out, silently and relentlessly tempting the dark abyss and the sleeping passions buried deep within our own souls.